Captain Charles Arman of the Lafayette Police Force was shot and killed on November 1st, 1927, as robbers unsuccessfully attempted to rob the Tippecanoe Loan and Trust Company in Lafayette, Indiana. Captain Charles Arman was 45, married without children. According to witnesses, 4 or 5 bandits entered the bank, which was located directly across the street from police headquarters. The bandits were unmasked and thought to be somewhere between 25 and 30 years of age. 1 or 2 bandits had remained outside with the car running. They ordered the 1 man and 6 women employees, along with a male and female customer, into the vault. However, Miss Margaret Cheney, secretary and treasurer of the bank, marched straight into the vault under cover of a robber and sneakily pressed the floor alarm. The alarm flashed an alert in the police station, where Captain Arman was alone because the other officers were in police court. Supposedly, when Arman entered the bank with his gun drawn, one of the robbers said, quote, "Oh, there you are," end quote, before firing on him. Arman fired back, but then faced down a volley of shots from other bandits. The gangster's reply landed with 1 shot in his forehead, 2 or 3 in his abdomen, and 1 in his leg. According to this account, the robbers grabbed a sack of money and then they bolted for the car and headed north. One of the gang having been wounded to the point that he had to be carried by the gang. A splotch of blood remained in the bank where he had stood. The Indianapolis Times tells us that a posse comprised of 100 plus local and state policemen, deputy sheriffs, National Guardsmen, and American Legion members pursued the fleeing robbers as, quote, dozens of officials, end quote, were on the lookout for a sextet of robbers. The car was described as heavy, powerful, and gray, and was thought to either be a Lincoln or a Hupmobile sedan. Either way, it had an Iowa license and was equipped with a machine gun. The posse believed the bandits switched cars shortly after leaving the bank, which might explain the Lincoln Hupmobile confusion. The robbers were also armed with, quote, heavy automatic pistols and sawed-off shotguns, end quote. These are the types of stories of bank robbers, safecrackers, and other ne'er-do-wells that we cover here on Decades of Gangsters from 1926 until 1941 and the U.S. involvement in World War II. Following the robbery, 2 police emergency squads armed with riot guns were stationed on roads north of Lafayette, Indiana. A call from Lafayette suggested the vehicle was indeed a Lincoln and noted a distinguishing mark. The left door of the car was apparently torn off. One eyewitness report stated that they'd seen, quote, one of the bandits hanging over the side bleeding badly, end quote. The Iowa plates used on the car turned out to have been stolen in Des Moines, Iowa a week before, taken from a Ford owned by a James Harvey. Police had 3 unnamed people in custody in Lafayette, though there was little hope held out that they'd offer much help or frankly even a connection. An airplane went airborne to help in the statewide search under control of Fort Wayne, Indiana lawyer and aviator Robert A. Bueller. By the next day, authorities began to think that at least part of this 6-member robbery crew had been in Indianapolis a week or so before the robbery. An anonymous letter that Police Chief Arthur G. Eversole of Lafayette, Indiana, received warned him that the bank at Fowler, Indiana, near Lafayette, would be held up, which was most likely a misdirection, and it was suspected to have been from one of the actual gang members. That letter indicated that a gang of 3 men, all who had served time at the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary, driving in a Hudson with Illinois or Ohio plates, would hit the Fowler Bank. Based on that letter, Indianapolis police guarded all the local banks and kept an eye out for that Hudson. 3 uniformed Indianapolis police and 2 detectives, along with state policeman Charles Bridges, received a tip that may have indicated the robbers' ultimate destination of Chicago, and searched the Windy City for those 6 bandits. The next day, the South Bend News-Times ran a story, "Officials Trace Clues to Holdup," subtitled, "Spectacles Found at Robbery Scene May Lead to Arrest." 2 pairs of glasses dropped by 2 of the now 7 bandits involved in this heist led police to Chicago. And they planned to visit the manufacturer of the glasses and frames to try to identify the make of the glasses and hopefully the optician who prescribed them. Meanwhile, 4 agents of Indiana's new Bureau of Identification searched for fingerprints. A notice went out about funeral services for Captain Arman. They were to be held Friday morning at 9 a.m. at St. Boniface Church in Lafayette. The following day, on November 4th, Lafayette, Indiana bankers launched a 1927-styled GoFundMe for the Arman widow. The Tippecanoe County Loan and Trust Company started with $1,000, and other city banks gave a total match for an additional $1,000, hopefully allowing the widow Arman the chance to grieve her murdered husband and to recover. All that violence and manpower expended, and it turned out that the bandits scored only $831. But staying in Lafayette, Indiana, we look at a different bank's issues. The South Bend News-Times ran an article, "Bankers to Face Trial for Fraud." A Tippecanoe County grand jury returned 16 indictments in connection with the failure of the People's Loan and Trust Company of Lafayette, Indiana, not to be confused with the Tippecanoe Loan and Trust Company that we just discussed. 2 indictments were placed against the president, John Jarrell, embezzlement and being an accessory before the fact. 5 indictments were returned against John M. McWilliams, the secretary and treasurer of the bank. State Bank Examiner John C. Sanders was charged with 2 indictments. 7 indictments were levied against Clarence Briggs, former bookkeeper, all embezzlement and larceny charges. The bank's announcement that Briggs had embezzled $25,000 is what led to the closure of the institution. So not a great week for Lafayette, Indiana banking. We first covered the robbery of the People's Trust and Savings Bank of LaPorte, Indiana, in November of 2024, 1 year ago. In the video, non-bank robber robs Miami, Florida bank. At the time, we turned to the Evening Star and noted that on November 12, 1926, 5 armed men entered the bank. One robber fired a sawed-off shotgun into the ceiling as the other 4 drew revolvers. The robbers, all described as well-dressed and around 30, hit the teller's tills, accruing about $40,000 in cash, and then forced cashier Harry Keller to open the vault, where they grabbed about $100,000 in negotiable securities. They then made their egress to a waiting car, which was seen heading east towards South Bend, Indiana. Now here we are 1 year later, and part of that $100,000 of stolen bonds were seized, and local officials were then searching for the man who left them at the bank. In fact, a warrant had been issued for the man's arrest back in Minneapolis, Minnesota, as that's where the suspect apparently hailed from. Note that the twin cities of St. Paul and Minneapolis were hotbeds of gangsters, bootleggers, and fencers at that time. Well, that warrant came through and resulted not in 1, but 3 men in Minneapolis being arrested by Hennepin County deputy sheriffs. The individuals that comprised that trio arrested were, quote, Chicago men, end quote, and were caught in the act of negotiating the sale of bonds. The man who left those bonds had requested that bank officials ascertain their value, as he wanted to convert them to cash. In order to figure out their value, the bank needed to confer with a Chicago firm that advised them that the bonds had been stolen. Authorities also learned that some of the bonds stolen from the People's Trust and Savings Bank had been seized in Bismarck, North Dakota, resulting in another warrant issued there for the arrest of that unnamed Minneapolis man. The People's Trust and Savings Bank filed 2 actions that same day And in a bit of a non sequitur, against two Chinese defendants who allegedly bought their $12,000 in bonds in good faith from unknown parties. Investigators began reviewing the $1 million stolen from 5 banks to try to identify the bonds. The 5 bank robberies that were being considered, most of which we covered previously, included again People's Trust and Savings in LaPorte, Indiana, the First National Bank of Columbus, Wisconsin, the Lee State Bank of Dowagiac, Michigan, the Merchants National Bank of Defiance, Ohio, and the Commercial Savings Bank of Galleon, Ohio. Right at the end of the month, the Milwaukee Leader kind of tied things up, at least for now. A trial date was planned to be set for the 3 still unnamed Chicago men. Now, a bit of a roundup of stories. An October newspaper article provided us details on Garvey Miles, Ben Davis, Mary Davis, and Fred Kinworthy. They'd all been captured by police and faced charges of stealing a number of vehicles. This is the crew at the time that's defied police, at least one of them shouting out, quote, "I will kill any policeman that comes within a mile of me," end quote. Specifically, police had been searching for Kinworthy for 2 years regarding various crimes, including bank robberies. We covered this in an October video titled Tear Gas Takedowns and the Gangsters Who Didn't Surrender. The Indianapolis Times gave us a little bit of a follow-up. Garvey Miles, we now know, was 25, and Kinworthy or Kenworthy, 40. It seemed that they'd waived the preliminary hearing, at least on the vehicle charges, and were then being held under $1,500 bonds, each of them. The Indianapolis Times ran an intriguing title, Hold Bank Suspect, Last of Tuxedo Bandits is Nabbed in Chicago. Wayne E. Brown's arrest in Chicago, Illinois, after he'd been shot by detectives, was thought to be the closing act of the robbery of the Tuxedo State Bank that had been robbed April 8th, and that's presumably 1927. He was in serious condition at the Bridewell Hospital. Brown had been tracked since September 22nd when he began cashing checks of the American Express Company. 2 other men were already serving terms for that heist. Not in Indiana, but geographically really close, we learned that Henry Fox, 50-year-old former cashier of the then-defunct Dolier Bank of Bridgeport, Ohio, had been acquitted of charges of making false entries, and charges of embezzlement were, quote, postponed, end quote. His defense contended that Fox made, quote, just an oversight, end quote, and the grand jury seemed to agree. We've covered parts of this ongoing saga since January of 1926, and then have followed up since, including in videos in September of 1927. Touching along the way with James Barker's sentencing and Matty McNeil's arrest and his time in jail. In that September 1927 video, we talked about bonds valued at approximately $5,000 and $36,000 of other securities, which were stolen from the Northwestern National Bank way back on December 8, 1924, had been recovered. At the time, Chicago police had trapped Albert Blair, quote, nationally known confidence man, end quote, under the name the Alabama Kid, along with Ambrose Cryer, a haberdasher. Capital State Bank President O.A. Christensen's suspicions were aroused when he was offered, quote, an unusually large commission, end quote, to dispose of some securities. That unusually large commission they offered Christensen was 20%. Further research showed him that they were stolen, so Christensen notified police and gave them the addresses of the men who'd made the offer. Detectives followed up and arrested the men at their homes. The bonds turned out to be from numerous robberies around the country, leading police to believe that Blair was acting as a, quote, clearinghouse, end quote, or fence. Upon Blair and Cryer's arrest, we found out that they tried to dispose of $41,000 worth of bonds, and that Blair was working under aliases George S. Briggs and James Smith. On November 8, 1927, that same day, the New Britain Daily Herald told us that Blair and Cryer had been arrested after attempting to dispose of $41,000 worth of bonds. They also updated Blair, not only known as the Alabama Kid, but also known as George S. Briggs and James Smith. And the Alabama Kid was also wanted in Chicago for his connection to a $15,000 conspiracy case that dated all the way back to 1914. Well, the September 19, 1927 Milwaukee Leader told us that the fourth and final member of the gang wanted in Milwaukee for that Northwestern National Bank heist had been arrested by Chicago police. It turned out to be William Dutch Canner, who was also wanted for murdering 2 women and 2 police officers in the St. Paul, Minneapolis area, and for participating in the robbery of the Superior, Wisconsin post office. Minnesota authorities were confident that they had enough evidence to prove his guilt for that quadruple murder, and he was wanted in other cities as well. Another gang member, as mentioned previously, James Barker, had been covered in different episodes, and he was serving a 3 to 8 year term in the Waupun Penitentiary for his part, but due to failing health, he was not expected to live that long. At one point or another, both Barker and Canner claimed to have driven the getaway car. Canner said that when he drove the getaway car, there were 4 robbers as passengers. One of them was Dave Berman. Berman, we reported, had recently died in a gunfight in New York. Well, clearly Berman did not die in that gunfight if the Milwaukee Leader's November 24, 1927 story, Bank Bandit Gets 12-Year Prison Term, is accurate, because Dave Berman, 24, allegedly the 5th member of the gang that held up the Northwestern National Bank, had been sentenced to 12 years in Sing Sing prison. Berman, wanted for a number of bank robberies throughout the Midwest, had engaged in a gun battle with Detective John Cordes in Central Park back in May and had been shot. Berman was also said to have partaken in the $85,000 Superior, Wisconsin post office robbery that took place in November of 1925, along with a $180,000 heist that took place in 1923 in none other than LaPorte, Indiana. Post office inspectors believe that Berman was part of a gang that stole more than $1 million in Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin, Illinois, Indiana, and in the big cities of Chicago and New York. Next Saturday, we head back, yet again, to the Mountain West, and we revisit a crew working in North Dakota and Montana that had begun to kill off its own gang members. If you can't trust a gang member, who can you trust?